I'd like to start with a poem that's also a prayer, Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple colour as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-cold chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted and pieced, fold, fallow and plough, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle, dim. He fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Think I can go home now, really. Now, I'm not giving several talks I could have given on this topic. One of the things I won't be doing is telling you about the papal teaching on green issues, which actually goes back to 1971 when it appeared in the first encyclical, and with John Paul II, then Benedict, and now with Francis is becoming fairly central teaching. But if I was going to have one picture as a backdrop for this talk, it would be a lovely photo, which you can look it up on the net, of the roof of St. Peter's taken across all the solar panels on the meeting hall in the Vatican. Some of you may know this already, but the Vatican is the first, and I think still the only, carbon neutral state in the world. Obviously easier than making Britain carbon neutral, but it's a nice symbol. I thought, being among Dominicans, it might be good to start with a definition. So I hope the definition of green is one that you'll accept. Committed to living in a way that appreciates, respects, and helps to preserve the whole variety of living things on our planet and the ecological systems that sustain them. So if that's a reasonable definition of green, why should Catholics be green? I'm going to give you 5 conditions, which I think are sufficient conditions for meeting that definition and possibly necessary conditions. The first is the belief in the goodness of other creatures and ecosystems, belief in goodness. The second is compassion for and desire to share good things beyond the narrow confines of what you might call us, the people we're most naturally connected to. The third is simple living. The fourth is openness to truth about the world and about our effect on the world. And the fifth is a belief that we can make a difference. So it seems to me that those 5 elements would make up being green, and that they're also central to the Orthodox Catholic Christian tradition, and probably to most serious religious traditions. So what I'd like to do this evening is just deal with each of those in turn by way of 5 objections, because I was told that what I should be doing this evening is trying to meet the objections to the thesis that I might be green because I'm a Catholic. So this is good Thomist style. Start with the objections. So objection 1, and this is one that you commonly hear. The trouble with environmentalism is it doesn't realise that all other creatures are there for human beings. All other creatures are there for the sake of human beings. Now, you can, if you look hard enough, I'm afraid, find that in Thomas Aquinas. But it doesn't originate with Christianity. It's not in the Bible. It comes into the Christian tradition through Greek philosophy, and we could talk more about that. Now, my reply to this objection is, if you're being strictly logical, even if all other creatures are there for the sake of human beings, it's not a reason to destroy them. But I want to say something a bit more than that. I think psychologically, it's actually very hard to care for other creatures if we don't value them directly. So even if logically we should value them anyway, psychologically, direct valuing of other creatures is what is going to help us if we want to be green. So let's think about the beginning of Genesis. And God saw that it was good, which of course is said in chapter 1 of Genesis several times before you get to human beings. And let's think about the meaning of good. What does it mean to talk about other creatures being good? Again, this discussion comes into the tradition, into the Christian tradition, from using outside sources, using the resources of Greek philosophy. And there was a debate among the Greeks about what it would mean to say that an animal was good. And the Stoics were quite clear about it. Animals were good just insofar as they were useful for human beings. So there was one Greek writing in this tradition who said that the elephants were there so that their tusks could be used for ivory. One of the well-known Stoics said that a pig had his soul, the point of a pig's soul was to function as salt, to keep him fresh until we ate him. So those are nice clear examples of that tradition. There's nothing to the creatures except their use for us. Aristotle, being a biologist, was able at least to give us the raw material for a different understanding of why animals might be good. And that was in terms of their own lifestyle. So why does an elephant have a trunk? If you ask Aristotle, he'll tell you about the elephant's lifestyle and how it goes underwater and it uses its trunk as a snorkel, and because it's got very, very heavy, it needs to use its four limbs for its weight, and so its trunk functions as a hand and so on. And that Aristotelian idea can be developed into the understanding creatures as good in themselves and in terms of their own lifestyle, much in the way that a modern biologist does, in the way that when you turn on a David Attenborough programme, everybody becomes fascinated by what the creatures are up to in themselves. And so the early Christians inherit these two traditions. They write a lot of commentaries on Genesis. They get fascinated by this question of what does it mean to say these creatures are good, particularly when tricky creatures come along like scorpions and maggots and things, and you've still got to say that they are good. And some of them try to do it in the Stoic way, some of them try to do it in the Aristotelian way, or mix it up a bit. Augustine actually is the person who really, really starts to get clear about this, because the Manichees with whom he's debating love bringing forward worms and scorpions and all these tricky animals as proof that the creator God couldn't be good. I mean, if you've got a scorpion, I mean, doesn't that prove that the creator wasn't good? And Augustine has to work out, understand philosophically, how to defend the position of the goodness of every single creature, flies, maggots, scorpions, and so on. And he does it in terms of their own lifestyle, saying that if you understand, at one point he says, I could speak at length in praise of the worm. And if you really understood the worm and watched it, you'd see its beauty, and you'd see how its beauty reflects its creator. So that idea of the goodness of each individual creature is used in the service of a worldview that isn't anthropocentric, but it isn't centred on the creatures either. It's always theocentric. You see the beauty and goodness of those creatures as a reflection of the goodness of God, just in the way that Hopkins did in the prayer I began with. And I'll just give you a little quotation here from one of Augustine's sermons. How do you know him? From the things he made. Question the beauty of the earth, question the beauty of the sea, question the beauty of the air. Question the living things that move in the waters, that amble about on dry land, that fly in the air. Question all these things. They all answer you, here we are, look, we are beautiful. Their beauty is their confession. So the beauty of the animals takes you straight to praise of God. So I think that is the first and really the most powerful and fundamental reason why Christians and indeed theists need to be green. Let's move on to the next objection. The next objection is, well, we shouldn't love other animals because we should only love God and other human beings. That's what we're told in Scripture. We shouldn't be loving other animals. And I'm afraid you can also find that objection in the works of St. Thomas. I hesitate to say it in this company, but it's true. The way to reply to that, I think, is first to say, yes, of course we should be loving other human beings, and especially the poorest human beings. And the poorest human beings, of course, are the ones that are most threatened by almost every kind of ecological damage, and almost every kind of serious ecological damage is caused by the richer human beings, usually through large-scale projects. And of course, when the richer human beings have messed up that bit of the world, they just move house to the smaller bit of the world that is still in a decent condition, and leave the poor to stay in the bit that's going to be flooded or has been polluted or has been desertified or whatever. So we should care about it for the poor. Secondly, for future generations. Catholic Christianity, of course, is enormously aware of the full dimensions of what Augustine would have called the city of God, human beings across time and across space. And now we're very conscious of the way in which that includes our future generations. It's not been a question for theologians before, because we've not envisaged before the possibility that we could so mess up our world that we aren't passing on to other people what we've received. But that Christian consciousness that we're pilgrims passing through this world, and the consciousness that future generations are as much part of the city of God as the past and as people across space, should make us deeply concerned and deeply ashamed of our inability to pass on our world in the condition we received it. So, even if we shouldn't love animals, we should be loving other human beings. But there's also a very, very strong Christian tradition of the saints and their love of animals. There are hundreds and hundreds of stories about saints and their kindness to and their love of animals. Most people say, St. Francis. We all know about St. Francis. St. Francis is the only one. St. Francis is the exception. St. Francis, when he appeared, was the latest, maybe one of the most imaginative, but the latest in a very, very long tradition which went right back to the Desert Fathers. And there are hundreds of wonderful stories. And as it's the feast of St. Patrick, I couldn't find a story about St. Patrick, but St. Kevin was one of the best-known saints with his animal stories. I don't know if you know the one about the blackbird that came and built a nest in his hand. And he stayed there because he was praying so hard. So he stayed there in an attitude of prayer until the young had fledged, because he didn't want to destroy them. It's a beautiful story. One of my favourites is St Macarius and the hyena, which appears... St Macarius heals the blind eyes of the hyena's pup. She comes and sort of drags him off to heal her pup. And it's told in a couple of versions, ancient versions. And what really intrigues me is that the way the story is told is very, very specifically modelled on the Gospels, with quotations from the Gospels. So that the monks who were writing those stories were seeing, not just saying the monks should be kind to animals, but the kindness to animals is an imitation of Christ in his healing and curing of human beings. So the tradition of saints loving animals is very strong. Third objection. And you hear that this is an objection that rather puzzles me, but you hear it quite often. Christian asceticism has been world-denying, and so it's anti-green. And sometimes this objection is linked to a specific criticism of St Augustine and the idea of original sin. I'm not quite sure how that works, but this objection comes up quite often in the literature. The idea that somehow Christian ascetics are world-denying, so they can't love the material world. Now, it's a particularly odd objection because, of course, Greens are far more aware than most people of our sinfulness in one particular area. So if we start being complacent about our capacity to sin, it seems rather harder to be aware of the damage we're doing. But they also preach, and they need to preach, a kind of asceticism. So my reply to this objection would be, well, first of all, if we'd actually all lived like most world-denying ascetics, there wouldn't be an ecological crisis. But it seems to me also that Christian asceticism has the right kind of asceticism, the kind of asceticism we need, because it actually hasn't been extreme and world-denying for the most part. It's had a kind of moderation and a balance and a prudence. Traditional, for instance, the caution in religious orders about what kinds of penance people are allowed to undertake, to make sure there's always a balance. Asceticism about food always being tempered by festal celebrations, by the duty of hospitality. And the reason that that prudence and that balance and that flexibility matters is that if the kind of simplicity of life that we need is going to be manageable, if it's actually going to be livable, it's got to be something that a lot of people can undertake and can commit themselves to. The philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe said on another issue, Christianity is a severe and practicable religion, not a beautifully ideal but impracticable one. And we need our asceticism to be practicable and yet at the same time serious. So to be moderate and flexible, but something that we're actually committed to. And also we need it to be community-based. It's no good it being something that a few heroic individuals have got to do by themselves. And on that point, I wonder whether actually we've really rather missed an opportunity by individualising and to some extent privatising the traditional Friday penance. It seemed that might have been actually an opportunity to do something collective, to make some kind of collective statement about our need to live simply. If you look at the history of asceticism, and specifically the history of abstinence from food, asceticism has always carried many meanings. People have fasted for protest, they've fasted for repentance, they've fasted for mourning, they've fasted out of solidarity with the poor. And each of those meanings that it's carried, not necessarily, they're not exclusive, that can carry several of them at once. Each of those meanings has slightly shaped the way that they've engaged in that practice. So I would wonder here whether actually it's not time to, well, first of all, to reclaim our communal tradition of seriously living simply, but also to give it a green twist so that it becomes symbolic as well as the other things of our care for the planet, so that we attend particularly to the kinds of simplicity that will help us live more lightly on the planet. Some of you might have noticed that the global Catholic climate movement celebrated Lent with a continuous fast through Lent, where each country undertook a 24-hour fast, and so that the whole 40 days of Lent were covered by the church across the world. And that's the kind of symbolic gesture that seems to me to be suggesting a way forward. I'll be quicker on my next two objections because I know I'm running out of time. Objection 4 really comes from the people who deny that there's a problem. And they usually deny there's a problem by saying there isn't a problem about climate change. Either climate change isn't happening or it's not man-made. Well, the simple response to that is that there are plenty of reasons to be green anyway, even if we're wrong about climate change. And that little pamphlet that Father John was showing you came out in 1995, and there isn't a mention of climate change in it. There's plenty of ways in which we're damaging and destroying the world, even leaving that aside. But the other part of the response would be, yes, of course, Catholics must be open to the truth, must be open to the scientific truth about the world and what we're doing to it. And I assume that Father Peter Hunter persuaded you all of that in the first lecture. But we also must be open to the truth about ourselves. And again, Augustine has some lovely things to say on this. In particular, in the context of the virtue of humility. For him, the virtue of humility is the virtue of being truthful about ourselves. And he's got a lovely little Latin tag, confessio not defensio, confession not defensiveness. We have to be prepared really to see the truth about ourselves, about our moral and our practical and our intellectual limitations, in order to be able to act wisely. And I think that's particularly interesting because a great deal of our failure to act in a green way is not because we don't care or don't want to, it's because either we don't notice what we're doing or we can't see how to do better. We feel we're trapped. So I think that intellectual humility combined with a real honesty and a real openness to the truth is essential. And quickly on objection 5. Objection 5, well, it's pointless anyway because we can't solve the problems, so let's just get on and focus on other things. And I think even if many of us don't say that explicitly, we maybe often feel it, and we're more half-hearted than we'd like to be in our efforts because we actually think, well, I can't do anything about it. It's just too big, it's too complicated, it's too unmanageable. And that, I think, is where faith really can help us. That sense that there is actually something much bigger and greater than us to trust in and to hope in. We're not in charge. To quote to T.S. Eliot, for us there is only the trying, the rest is not our business. So if I'm Catholic, should I be green? It seems to me that I don't usually use American slang, but I think the little phrase no-brainer is one I'm rather taken with. For the 5 reasons I've just mentioned. The goodness of other creatures, the need for a wide-ranging compassion, simple living, openness to the truth, and hope. But then I wanted to turn the question round the other way. I may be green because I'm a Catholic. Should I be a Catholic because I'm green? Now, not necessarily, of course, because a lot of the things I've been saying are central to other religions and even other forms of non-religious philosophy. But I'm very aware of it time I think about this, and I've touched on it already, of the gap between our words and ideas and our practice. It seems to me that more than any other moral question, we find it really difficult to close the gap between where we'd like to be and what we actually manage to do. And it seems to me if we really are going to move forward, we need something like the church. We need a collective action. We need to be able to act together as a community. We need serious moral realism. We need pastoral and moral leadership. And we probably need grace and sacraments and the moral community to support us. So if there are some Catholics in the audience who aren't yet green, I hope I've started to persuade you. If there are some Greens in the audience who aren't Catholics, I'd say we're on your side. If there are some in the audience who are convinced Greens and unsure whether or not they're Catholics, I'd say please give the church a chance because we need you as much as you need us. So, thank you very much.